April 15th, 2013, our nation's routine was halted and the manhunt for Joe Carr and Tamerlan Tsarnaev began. After committing the Boston Marathon bombings, the brothers ran from the authorities, and in the early hours of April 19th, Tamerlan died of wounds suffered during the shootout. As the public gaze remained fixed on the manhunt to find Joe Carr, a different controversy emerged within Boston. According to the New York Daily News of April 24th, 2013, several cemeteries across 3 states refused to accept the corpse of Tamerlan Tsarnaev for burial. The Huffington Post of April 20th, 2013 quoted the Islamic Institute of Boston, who said, "I will not do a funeral for him. Not here." According to Massachusetts law, any deceased person shall be decently buried, entombed, or cremated within a reasonable time after death. But the law doesn't require cemeteries to accept the body, which allowed the governor and several city mayors to refuse. More than a week after Tamerlan's death, funeral home director Peter Stefan of Worcester, Massachusetts, agreed to find his body a final resting place. And the news was met with rage, as hundreds of people protested outside Stefan's funeral home, calling him a terrorist and sending death threats. Forbes magazine of May 14th, 2013 believes that our resistance to burying Tamerlan Tsarnaev reveals much about how we communicate about our chief obligations as a civilized society. Try as we might to rhetorically separate the sin from the sinner, the Boston Globe on May 11th, 2013 says we can't. Publicly and profoundly rejecting the unwanted dead warrants analysis because it simultaneously protects and destroys freedom of religion, while also raising questions about the rhetorical obligations of the living. Today we will ask the research question: what does the rejection of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's body demonstrate about society's perceived ethics surrounding the unwanted dead? We will first turn to Elizabeth Otta A. Wright's article, Rhetorical Places and Memorial Places, published in the June 2009 Rhetoric Society Quarterly. This article considers the rhetorical symbolism of cemeteries and why the public responds so powerfully to burial controversy, making this a great lens for analysis. Second, we will apply Wright's model to the rejection of Tsarnaev's body before finally drawing implications. Wright explains most modern cultures bury their deceased in a designated location, a cemetery. She explains that placing a body in the ground transforms a meaningless place into a rhetorically potent space. Wright believes that cemeteries spark controversy by serving 3 rhetorical functions. First, they grant humanity. Second, distort the truth. And third, reflect an ideal society. First, cemeteries grant humanity to people who otherwise lacked it. Wright uses the example of socially disenfranchised groups like women or former slaves. While history marginalized women and spoke of slaves as less than human, upon death, the cemetery was able to do something that no newspaper or social movement could do: lay men, women, and former slaves side by side, finally in equality. Second, when a body is buried, physical tokens are left behind: the body, a coffin, a grave marker. Wright explains that a body, a coffin, a grave marker. Wright explains that the body, a coffin, a grave marker. Wright explains that the living look at these and reimagine the significance of the life lived. But because the dead can't speak for themselves, the living often misinterpret the truth of these lives, changing their own perceptions of history in the process. And third, cemeteries reflect an ideal society. Wright explains that we transform burial grounds to reflect a history we find acceptable. She uses the example of a slave graveyard unearthed in New England. Modern residents didn't want to publicize the rediscovered cemetery because to them, it revealed the North was guilty of slave owning and segregation. So they paved over it, entombing not only the dead, but the town's dark past with slavery. Because the dead can't speak for themselves, the living use cemeteries to project desire and meaning into our communities. Now that we have an understanding of Wright's model, we can apply it to the rejection of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's body. First, citizens, including government officials, rejected Tamerlan's corpse specifically to deny him humanity. Slate magazine on May 9th, 2013 noted that hundreds of people protesting outside Peter Stefan's funeral home claimed that their own humanity would be corrupted by sharing a cemetery with Tsarnaev. After accepting the corpse, Peter Stefan boldly told the New York Times on May 3rd, 2013, "I'm not burying a terrorist. I'm burying a dead body." Although the public was afraid to grant Tsarnaev humanity, Stefan ultimately had the final word, which he used to publicly defend Tsarnaev's right to a dignified, humane burial. Second, CNN found on May 11th, 2013, that Tsarnaev's body found a resting place, a Muslim burial ground, and an unmarked grave. The absence of a grave marker means that over time, Tsarnaev's body will become unrecognizable to the public. No one will be able to visit or celebrate his life. Now, Peter Stefan told the aforementioned Boston Globe article that everyone who is dead has a right to be buried. But does the absence of a grave marker fall short of keeping this promise? Because grave markers allow the living to see the burial space and reimagine the life lived, withholding one also strips Tsarnaev of humanity, banishing his remains to an eternity of solitude. And finally, cemeteries reflect an ideal society. In the modern-day United States, that is a nation free of terrorism. The Guardian on May 11th, 2013, quoted one of the protesters outside Peter Stefan's funeral home as saying, "Bury this terrorist on U.S. soil and we will unbury him." Although from a humanitarian standpoint, we tend to respect the dead and their burial rights, when it comes to terrorism, it is no holds barred. By rejecting Tsarnaev's body, we rejected extremism in order to erase him from our country's collective memory and to preserve our own idealistic society. We can return to our research question. What does the rejection of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's body demonstrate about society's perceived ethics surrounding the unwanted dead? The analysis reveals that America's ethical code applies only to those who fit within the boundaries of acceptable society. Anyone labeled a terrorist will likely have their rights revoked at the request of an angry public, or even government officials who want to preserve the American image. This prompts two implications: a value paradox and evolving social contract philosophy. First, those who interfered with Tsarnaev's body by denying him of his final rights also interfered with his faith and beliefs in the afterlife. Although his body was washed and shrouded, necessary for a proper Muslim burial, waiting weeks to bury him went against another equally important practice in Islam: burying the body as quickly as possible, preferably within 24 hours following death. The dispute over Tamerlan's corpse not only denied him of his final rights, but to believers, interfered with his afterlife. Following the death of Osama bin Laden, BBC reported on October 25th, 2011, that Americans were unaccepting and angry that President Obama ordered a burial at sea within 12 hours of his death to adhere to Islamic tradition. Burying the unwanted dead seems to create a paradox. Americans want to uphold the values of nationalism, while simultaneously desecrating freedom of religion. Second, an act of terrorism seems the absolute worst way a person can violate their social contract. Not only did Tsarnaev harm others, he did so through terrorism. Does this ultimate crime relinquish his rights to humanity and thus a burial? Well, consider that the Boston Globe on May 5th, 2013 reported that countless mass murderers, presidential assassins like Lee Harvey Oswald, and people who have committed heinous crimes have all been buried in public places before, and the public said nothing. Wright explains that Americans react instantaneously and brutally to terrorism. We rejected Tamerlan's body to reject extremism in order to preserve our own idealistic society. But perhaps by accepting Tamerlan's corpse, Peter Stefan did more to preserve the true American image, one of tolerance and acceptance, which is so much more than what rejecting a body ever could do. Today we applied Wright's model to the rejection of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's body and drew implications. Whether they are criminals, the homeless, or anyone living outside the margins, the death of Tamerlan Tsarnaev forces us to consider the burial and symbolism of the unwanted dead, so that we may operate ethically as the living.